Daniel Hayes spent 20 years behind bars for the murder of Emily Carson, a young woman found dead in her apartment on a cold November night in 1999. But what if the evidence that put him there was wrong from the very beginning? What if the real killer was never caught and is still out there? This is the haunting story of how one man lost half his life to a crime he swore he never committed, and the disturbing mystery that still surrounds Emily's death. It was a cold evening in November 1999 in a small suburban town just outside Dallas, Texas, when everything changed forever. The streets were quiet, the kind of neighborhood where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked, and children played outside without worry. But at around 11:45 p.m., the peace was shattered. Neighbors living in the same apartment complex as 23-year-old Emily Carson later reported hearing a sudden crash, followed by muffled noises that lasted only a few minutes. No one called the police right away, thinking it might have been a dropped object or an argument that would soon calm down. By morning, Emily was found dead inside her apartment. The scene inside was grim. The living room showed signs of a violent struggle. A lamp had been knocked over, cushions were scattered, and one of the window blinds hung broken as if someone had grabbed it during the fight. Emily was discovered lying on the floor near her couch. She had multiple bruises, and investigators quickly determined that she had been strangled. Forensics at the time were limited, and the small town police force didn't have the advanced tools that larger cities were beginning to use. Instead, they relied heavily on what they could see and what neighbors claimed they had heard. Among the scattered items in the apartment, detectives found something that would shape the course of the entire investigation: a broken wristwatch, lying just a few feet from Emily's body. The strap was torn and the face was cracked, as if it had been yanked off during the struggle. Officers quickly traced the watch to Daniel Hayes, a 25-year-old local mechanic who lived only a few blocks away. Daniel had worked on cars for most of his adult life and was well known around the neighborhood for his quiet, hardworking nature. But in the eyes of the investigators, the discovery of his watch at the crime scene was damning. Neighbors added more weight to the suspicion. One resident told police she had seen someone resembling Daniel walking near Emily's apartment late that night. Though her statement was vague and uncertain, detectives were convinced it supported their theory. They believed the case was already coming together. With the watch as physical evidence and the neighbor's testimony as support, Daniel was quickly placed at the top of the suspect list. Within just a few days, police showed up at his home, arrested him, and began building the case that would ultimately take away the next 20 years of his life. Daniel's trial began in the spring of 2001, less than 2 years after Emily Carson's death. The courtroom was filled with tension from the very first day. Local newspapers had covered the case heavily, painting Daniel as the prime suspect from the moment of his arrest. By the time the jury was selected, many people in the community already believed he was guilty. The prosecution came prepared with a clear narrative. Daniel Hayes had murdered Emily Carson in a fit of rage. They leaned heavily on the wristwatch found at the scene, presenting it as undeniable proof that he had been inside her apartment during the struggle that ended her life. The prosecutors painted Daniel as a man with a hidden temper, someone who could snap behind closed doors despite his clean public image. They argued that the broken watch was ripped from his wrist as Emily tried to defend herself. To strengthen their case, they brought in a neighbor who testified that she saw a man matching Daniel's description near the apartment building that night. Her testimony was uncertain, but prosecutors emphasized it, repeating that Daniel was the only logical suspect who lived close enough and who had a personal connection to the victim. The personal connection was thin. Daniel had fixed Emily's car once at his shop, but the jury was told it was enough to make him familiar with her. The defense, on the other hand, struggled to create reasonable doubt. Daniel's attorney argued that the watch could have been planted or stolen before the murder, and that the neighbor's testimony was vague at best. Daniel himself insisted he had been home alone, watching television at the time of Emily's death, but with no witness to confirm his alibi. It sounded weak against the prosecution's carefully arranged story. Forensic testing available then was limited, and the defense had no scientific evidence to counter the state's claims. As the days passed, the jury watched a young woman's life described in detail, and the memory of her violent death weighed heavily on their minds. Daniel, sitting quietly at the defense table, appeared cold and detached to some, which prosecutors suggested was a sign of guilt. After less than a week of testimony, the jury deliberated for only 3 hours. The verdict was unanimous, guilty of murder. When the judge sentenced him to life in prison, Daniel was just 26 years old. For the community, it seemed like justice had been served. For Daniel, it was the beginning of 2 decades behind bars for a crime he swore he never committed. Prison life began as a shock for Daniel Hayes. He had walked into the county courthouse as a free man, but left chained and escorted through thick steel doors that shut behind him with an echo he would never forget. The transition from a small town mechanic to an inmate serving life for murder was brutal. He quickly learned that in prison, weakness made you a target. The first years were filled with constant tension, sleepless nights, and the sound of fights breaking out in nearby cells. Daniel kept to himself, eating in silence, avoiding confrontations, and watching the days blur together under harsh fluorescent lights. Letters from the outside were rare. His parents wrote faithfully at first, but as the years went by, their health began to decline. By 2009, both had passed away, leaving Daniel with no immediate family to support him. Friends he had once trusted drifted away as well, some too busy with their own lives, others unwilling to stay connected to a convicted murderer. The isolation grew heavier each year, pressing down like the weight of the concrete walls around him. He began spending long hours in the prison library, losing himself in books about history, law, and religion. Reading gave him a way to escape the reality of his cell, if only for a few hours. Despite the loneliness, Daniel refused to give up on his innocence. He wrote letters to lawyers, nonprofit organizations, and journalists, begging them to look at his case. Most went unanswered. Occasionally he received polite replies, telling him there was little that could be done. Every rejection stung, but he kept sending them, convinced that someone someday would listen. His appeals through the courts were consistently denied, judges insisting that the evidence against him was solid enough to uphold the conviction. Years passed in a slow rhythm of routines, count times, meals, work assignments, lockdowns. Daniel worked in the prison workshop, fixing broken chairs and tables, a faint reminder of his old life as a mechanic. Some guards treated him with indifference, others with suspicion, but he stayed out of trouble and earned a reputation as a quiet inmate who never caused problems. Still, the whispers of his case followed him. Some prisoners believed he was guilty and avoided him. Others thought he might truly be innocent, a man trapped by the system. Through it all, Daniel clung to one belief: the truth had to come out eventually. He told himself that he could endure another year, another month, another day, because the real story of Emily Carson's death was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. In 2019, 2 decades after Daniel Hayes had been locked away, his case caught the attention of a young attorney working with the Innocence Project. She had been reviewing old convictions where physical evidence might still exist for modern testing, and Daniel's file stood out. The trial records were thin, built mostly on the broken wristwatch and the neighbor's uncertain testimony. What troubled her most was how little forensic science had been used in the investigation. At the time, DNA testing was limited and often unreliable in small jurisdictions. Now, with advancements, she believed the evidence could reveal something very different. Her first step was to track down the physical items from Emily Carson's apartment. After weeks of searching through dusty boxes in the county evidence room, she located samples that had been stored away and forgotten. Hairs collected from the crime scene, scrapings from Emily's fingernails, and clothing she had been wearing that night. All had been sealed but never fully tested. With court approval, the samples were sent to a modern lab for analysis. When the results returned, they revealed something that shook the case open. None of the DNA matched Daniel Hayes. Instead, the hair samples and partial prints pointed to an unidentified male who had never been entered into the system. The discovery raised serious questions about the original investigation. Why had the police been so quick to close the case? Why had the wristwatch been treated as irrefutable proof when it carried no blood, sweat, or fingerprints linking Daniel to the crime? The attorney dug deeper, reviewing the timeline of Daniel's arrest. It became clear that once his watch was found, investigators had focused almost exclusively on him, ignoring other potential leads. Witness statements that didn't match their theory had been quietly dismissed, and other suspects, people closer to Emily, had never been properly investigated. As the Innocence Project team gathered new evidence, they prepared to challenge Daniel's conviction in court. They built a file showing how unreliable the neighbor's testimony was, how flimsy the prosecution's theory had been, and how the physical evidence now excluded Daniel entirely. After years of being ignored, Daniel finally had advocates fighting for him. For the first time in nearly 20 years, there was hope. But hope came with new questions. If Daniel was innocent, who was the unknown man whose DNA was left behind in Emily Carson's apartment? And why had he never been identified? The answers were nowhere in sight. In late 2020, after months of hearings and legal motions, Daniel Hayes was finally granted his freedom. When the judge announced the conviction was overturned, Daniel stood silently, almost frozen, as if the words didn't belong to him. For 20 years he had imagined this moment, yet when it arrived it felt unreal. Walking out of the prison gates, he stepped into the sunlight as a free man, but he was not the same person who had entered at 26. At 46, his hair had thinned and turned gray, his face lined with years of stress, and his eyes carried the weight of 2 decades lost. Cameras captured the moment, and headlines declared him another tragic example of wrongful conviction. But freedom was complicated. Daniel had no family waiting for him, no home to return to, no job to step into. He had spent more time in prison than he ever had outside as an adult. The world had changed drastically. Cell phones, the internet, even the way people lived their daily lives were foreign to him. He was free, yet adrift, carrying the haunting knowledge that Emily Carson's real killer had never been caught. The wristwatch that tied him to the crime still remained a mystery. How had it ended up in her apartment? Daniel swore he had lost it days before the murder, but no one had ever investigated that claim. The Innocence Project arranged housing and counseling, and reporters followed him for weeks, eager to hear his story. Some hailed him as a symbol of resilience, while others whispered doubts, wondering if the court had truly set a guilty man free. Even with DNA evidence proving otherwise, suspicion lingered in the eyes of many who remembered the original trial. For Daniel, the hardest part was knowing Emily's family had never received real justice. They had believed for 20 years that he was the one responsible. Now they were left with unanswered questions, just as he was. The case was officially closed, the police reluctant to reopen an investigation 2 decades old. Yet the unknown DNA profile remained in the system, waiting for a match. Somewhere, a man who had left traces in Emily Carson's apartment was still out there. Daniel had his freedom, but the truth was incomplete. Every night, as he adjusted to life beyond bars, he carried the uneasy thought that the real killer had escaped justice, and that the full story of what happened on that November night in 1999 was still buried in shadows.